continues to rise, and we're all getting into a worse fundamental situation than we had before, and we're all going to pay for it. Be very careful and worried about 2013 and 2014. It is ludicrous that you have these people in Washington and who are, quote, saving the world, but these are the people who, few of them saw the problems coming. Few of the people on Wall Street running Wall Street companies saw the problems coming, and yet they've all walked away with tens of millions of dollars. The guy who ruined Merrill Lynch is now an extremely wealthy man. The man who ruined Citibank is now an extremely wealthy man. The guy who was head of the New York Stock Exchange, which supposedly was a cooperative, like a cooperative, walked away with over $100 million. It is absolutely outrageous what these people have gotten away with. And now they're still turning around. I mean, you go down to Washington, and the people who caused the problem, Bernanke, Greenspan and Bernanke, and the guys at the Federal Reserve, are now supposedly saving us from the problem. They're making the situation worse. They never saw it coming in the first place. They didn't understand it. They don't understand it. And now they're making it worse. The head of economists at the Federal Reserve around 2007, 2008, wrote a paper saying, you know, we have hundreds of the finest economists, PhD economists in the world here on the staff of the Federal Reserve. There are people out there who say that housing is going to be a crisis, that it's going to be a collapse, and it's going to cause economic problems. Who are these people? How can these people say something like that when we have hundreds of economists, PhD economists, who say it's not going to happen? Now, this man was the chief economist of the Federal Reserve, and yet all of those guys are still down there. They have their jobs. They were totally wrong. They caused these gigantic problems. They're still there. They still have their jobs. And worse than that, they're now telling us how to solve the problems. Everybody's in favor of prosperity, a chicken in every pot. Everybody should be a homeowner. All politicians say these kinds of things, and all politicians do whatever they can to make sure we all own homes. Unfortunately, they forget that somebody has to pay for this, and usually when they forget that somebody has to pay for it, we all wind up having to pay for it, and in this particular case, we all wound up having to pay a lot for their foolishness. Huge. I mean, HUD and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac cost us all billions and billions of dollars. You know, that guy Cuomo was head of the housing authority down in Washington. Huge failure, got elected governor of New York. The guy who was running Fannie Mae walked out of there with tens of millions of dollars. And accounting fraud the whole way. And now he's walking around a very, very, very rich man. American government and public are having to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to save, and maybe more, maybe even trillions with all their off-balance sheet financing. Nobody's paying. Everybody's walking away fat, happy, and sassy. Except the taxpayers, except all of us who are stuck with these jerks' mistakes. Well, that's what Congress in its wisdom decided we should all have, to encourage home ownership. Is it good? Is it bad? I don't know. Other countries don't have it, but it's part of this whole thing of encouraging us all to go and buy a home and own a home. Come on. Some of the things that come out of these guys' mouths, it's incomprehensible, some of the things they say. So now it's bad that people say, let's say, first of all, that suggests that it's bad that people save and invest for the future, which of course is absolutely ludicrous. Every economist in the world knows you need savings and investing to build an economy. But the idea that people who saved in Asia led to our problems here, I mean, it's so laughable. You would think that grown men wouldn't say things like that out loud. They also say things like, Well, the solution to too much debt is more debt. I mean, I cannot comprehend that people, adults, would say things like that out loud, and yet they do. And other people listen to them. It's mind-boggling to me. Alan Greenspan, if any one person in world history, in the world economy, in the world, is responsible for what happened, the single point man would be Alan Greenspan. He constantly bailed people out. He constantly printed money when his friends on Wall Street said they needed help. Starting in '87, every time there was a problem, call up Mr. Greenspan, help, save me, save me, save me, save me. And he did. You know, for instance, when the long-term capital management crisis hit in 1998, they all called and said, save the world, Mr. Greenspan. He pumped money into the system. Now, if he hadn't pumped money into the system, Lehman Brothers would still be in business. Bear Stearns would still be in business, because all of those firms would have suffered so badly and lost so much money. They would have fired a lot of incompetent people. Their capital would have been damaged, and they wouldn't have been able to do all these things. But Mr. Greenspan rode in, pumped in money. They were all had a big revival. The stock market went up. And so when problems came again, he did the same thing. He started pumping money in. He pumped money in every chance he got. And of course, that meant eventually all of these firms got so overextended and so leveraged and had so many people working for them who shouldn't have been working for them that in the end, the whole system fell apart. He caused a consumption bubble. He caused a housing bubble. He caused a stock market bubble. All of this time, constantly printing money whenever he could. If there's one person that we can blame all this on, it's Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve, followed, of course, and helped, of course, by Mr. Bernanke, his successor. Well, no, of course, people had figured out from Mr. Greenspan that whenever there was a problem, he would come pumping money into the system. He did it in '94 when Kidder Peabody got in trouble. He did it when Orange County got into trouble. Every time something went wrong, he would ride in. It became known as the Greenspan put. Everybody knew that when something went wrong, Greenspan would pump money into the system. The way the system is supposed to work, when somebody fails, they go bankrupt, there's reorganization, and you start over. Mr. Greenspan wouldn't let that happen. He constantly tried to prevent people from failing, because I don't know why he did, mainly because the people were calling on. Mr. Greenspan was never a very smart person. Mr. Greenspan failed on Wall Street 2 or 3 times. So, you know, he was looking for government jobs. He got government jobs because he never could make it in the private sector. So when the private sector called him, he thought he was beholden to them because he thought they must be smarter than he was, and he was right about that. But he bailed them all out, and it started long before long-term capital management. It started long before Bear Stearns. It started almost the first day he got into office. Once he took office in the summer of 1987, we had the big crash in 1987, partly because of him, because some of the things he said in public back then scared the socks off a lot of people, including me. He's been a disaster since he got there. It made a huge difference. You know, when the banks were told you got to make loans, you got to give mortgages, and if you don't give mortgages, we're going to penalize you. You know what they did? They made mortgages. They made mortgages to people that shouldn't have had mortgages. And then, of course, the people who got the mortgages said, this is so much fun. I want 2 mortgages. I want 3 mortgages. It doesn't matter that I don't have a job. It doesn't matter that I don't have a down payment. You know, I like buying all these houses. Then, of course, they took them to the banks, and the banks sliced them and diced them and turned them into even more leveraged paper and sold a lot of it to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who would buy anything that came in the door because they were told they had to, and they wanted to because they thought they would make a lot of money. Their executives could get big bonuses, and the rest of us wound up stuck. No, of course there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it, and the people who bought them and who made mistakes should have been allowed to fail, going to excess. But if people make mistakes, buying things that they shouldn't have bought, they should be allowed to fail. Nothing wrong with the process, nothing wrong with the securitization. What happened was they went to excess, and then rather than letting the people who made the mistakes fail, the government said, we cannot let anybody fail. They all called up the central bank, said, you've got to save Western civilization. In other words, you got to save my job, is what they were telling them, the central bank, and they came in and did it. There's nothing wrong with any of this. We had regulations. All of this was supposed to be regulated. Banking and insurance and mortgages are three of the most heavily regulated parts of the American economy. That's where the problems were. It wasn't so much we didn't have regulations or insufficient regulations. It was the regulators who didn't know what they were doing, who didn't enforce regulations. No. There's nothing wrong with any of these things. First of all, it's the people who went to excess, who made mistakes, the people who bought this stuff, the people who sold this stuff, were selling stuff and buying stuff that they shouldn't have. But let them do it. If people want to make mistakes, fine, let them make mistakes. But then don't bail them out. Make them go bankrupt. No, there's nothing wrong with any of this. Nothing wrong with any of these instruments that come up. The problem is that many players went to excess and bought and sold things that they should not have bought and sold. That somebody could have sat and done his homework and said, okay, these things, I wouldn't buy these things. Look, there were plenty of people at the time who could see that these things were going to fail. Many people made a lot of money because they could see that these were going to fail. There's nothing wrong with the instruments. It's what happened with the instruments and the fact that, shall I say, gullible people bought them and sold them. There were plenty of people who knew that this was going to collapse, but they first of all, they weren't listened to at the time, and the second of all, in fact, they were laughed at in many cases, and second of all, people bought them anyway. Sure, many things. First of all, when there's too much speculation in the market, you raise margin requirements. Mr. Greenspan refused to raise margin requirements. He even said a couple of times, as the stock market bubble was taking off, said, well, we could raise margin requirements, but I don't think it'll do any good. Well, he's totally wrong about that. Raising margin requirements has always had an effect, especially if you raise them high enough. They should have done that back in the Depression, the bubble in 29. They should have raised margin requirements before that. You could find out that what they did back then, Bernanke says they should have printed more money. So he's now printing, but he doesn't understand that was a question of solvency. This is a different thing. This is a question of too much leverage, and Mr. Greenspan and Mr. Bernanke have taken the wrong actions because they misinterpreted what was the problem, and instead of solving the problem, they've made the problem worse. I would have done away with Glass-Steagall. I certainly think that the markets should be open and free. They are in other parts of the world. The other parts of the world didn't have Glass-Steagall, and they seem to survive quite well and seem to have grown and done well and been very competitive. In fact, they became more and more competitive with the U.S. The reason that we had problems in the financial community in the first decade of the 21st century was not because they repealed Glass-Steagall, it was because many other things happened, including this whole absurdity that people had to own houses and banks had to pay for them or had to make loans whether they wanted to or not. Well, we've already, the stock market has been going sideways for 13 or 14 years now, so we have to some extent stagflation now. We do have inflation, even though the government lies about it. Nearly every country in the world has inflation, and they acknowledge that they have inflation. I find it incomprehensible that America would be the only country in the world that doesn't have inflation when everybody else does and everybody else acknowledges it. So we have stagflation now. The economy's been going sideways. People's standard of living has continued to stagnate and go and decline in all of this period of time. So we've got stagflation now, and it's going to get worse. We certainly interest rates should not be so low first of all. In America, we have tiny interest rates, and the effect of that is to destroy the class of people who save and invest for the future. Tens of millions of Americans didn't go deep into debt. They paid their mortgages. They didn't buy 4 or 5 houses with no money down and no jobs. They did everything right. They paid for their kids going to college. That class of people is being destroyed because interest rates are minuscule. They save looking for the future, and now they're being wiped out. At the expense of, they're doing it at their expense, in saving the people who did all the things wrong, the people who went and borrowed big money, defaulted on their loans, caused huge problems in the financial markets. We're saving them and destroying the people who save and invest for the future. This is going to have very bad consequences for society. It always has throughout history when you wipe out that class of people, and we're doing it right now. So interest rates are much too low right now. We do have inflation. Mr. Volcker came in when we had inflation, and he was told, he was just a bureaucrat, so he did what he was told. They said to him, destroy inflation. He raised interest rates and kept raising interest rates until he finally popped the inflation bubble. Now, he didn't do it by himself. People like to give him credit for it. Lots of other things happened. The bear market came back to commodities. We finally had some extra supply of oil. The North Sea oil started flowing. Alaskan oil started flowing. So we had a lot of extra supply coming into the commodities markets, which caused them to go down. At the same time, he raised interest rates as high as he could, cutting demand. So he basically helped kill inflation with his actions. Do we need another Paul Volcker? Yes. In my view, as I said, the current Federal Reserve is doing exactly the wrong thing. What they should be doing is letting the market determine interest rates. But if they're not going to do that, they should be raising interest rates to reflect real inflation and stop wiping out the people who save and invest. Well, the first thing we should learn is that there ought to be a lot of people going to jail right now. In the savings and loan crisis, hundreds of people went to jail because they committed criminal acts. There was lots of prosecutions, and we helped clean out the system. This time around, virtually nobody has gone to jail, so far anyway. There are lots of people we all know who took millions, tens of millions out of the system with at least marginal acts, if not totally dishonest acts. This time around, nothing's happened. I don't know why we don't have a lot of people going to jail. The crisis caused by the people in the last 5 or 10 years is much, much worse than what happened with the savings and loan problems back in the early 90s. Well, Sarbanes-Oxley is one of the reasons that much of the American financial transactions are moving offshore. Look, we didn't need Sarbanes-Oxley. It was always against fraud. Was always against the law. We had those laws in place. We just came up with more complex, more convoluted and complicated laws, which that scare people away. And fraud was always against the law. You didn't have to have new and special laws. I think the reason Lehman happened to be the first one Bear Stearns was the first one to get in trouble, but when they saved them, there was a huge amount of criticism, and remember it was Republicans who saved him, so they were vulnerable much more criticism because Republicans are not supposed to bail out people who have failed. So when Lehman was the next to come up, and so when they came up, my view is that in Washington they say, well, we've got to let somebody fail because if we don't, they continue to yelp at us and we bail out another one, we're going to suffer very, very badly at the polls, and our image and our voters are going to be very unhappy. So since Lehman was the next to come along, they had to let them fail. Well, whatever TARP was sold at, it was a mistake. The basic mistake was that they bailed out people who failed. Look, the way the system is supposed to work, when people fail, smart, competent people come in, take over the assets, reorganize the assets, and start over again from a sound base. what they're doing this time around is, when people fail, they take the money away from the competent people, give it to the incompetent people, and say to the incompetent people, okay, now you can compete with the competent people with their own money. I mean, this is outrageous morality. Politicians don't care about morality. It's outrageous economics. It has never worked when you try this. They tried it in Japan, Japan's had 2 lost decades because they refused to let anybody fail. We've already had 1 lost decade. We're going to have 2. We may have a lost century at the rate we're going. No, this is bad economics, bad morality, and it's not going to work. Most of the stimulus bills were paying off political allies. I mean, a lot of the stimulus bills under Obama and even under Bush went to the state governments so that they could retain the bureaucrats. I think something like 40% of the money went to the states so that they didn't have to fire bureaucrats. I hardly call that stimulus. In Asia, they'd saved a lot of money for a rainy day, and when it started raining, they started spending the money. But most of the money they spent was to increase future productivity and future competitiveness, whereas in America, listen, hiring bureaucrats is not going to help increase our competitiveness down the road, but that's a lot of what we did. No, they were just throwing money out as fast as they could because somebody told them Western civilization is going to collapse. I want you to know we've had banks fail for centuries, insurance companies fail for centuries. It may be very painful for a while, but so what? The world gets over it and starts over from a sounder base. In Scandinavia, in the early 90s, they had the same problem. They let people fail. Lots of people failed. They had a horrible 3-year period when the people were getting wiped out. But then after that, they had a wonderful 15-year rise because they'd started from a sound base. The Japanese, at the same time, had 2 lost decades because they refused to let people fail. Dodd-Frank is going to be a nightmare and a disaster for all of us. Finance is not a good place to be anymore because the politicians, there are other reasons too, but politicians keep coming up with all these insane regulations, controls, and taxes that are going to make finance a terribly bad place to be. Dodd-Frank, I think it was 2,700 pages. Most of the congressmen had not read it. It was full of provisions that they were going to have to let people, special committees, study this issue and come up with the regulations. These are regulations that are not even going to Congress. They're just going to be all sorts of bureaucratic, academic requirements going forward. And listen, American finance is going to be in a decline, a relative decline for 2 or 3 more decades. Just like after coming out of the Depression, out of the 30s, they passed all these regulations, most of which turned out to be absurd, which made finance not a very good place to be. The same thing is happening now, plus other things. So the finance is not going to be, and of course it's driving a lot of business outside of America. 10 years ago, most large IPOs, initial public offerings, were done in New York. Now very few are done in New York. They're done outside of the U.S. because they keep coming up with these absurd regulations that nobody wants to raise money in the U.S. It's a nightmare. Quantitative easing is another absurd thing which they're doing. They say they're saving us. Mr. Bernanke's down there printing money, buying up junk assets. 5 years ago, the central bank had on its balance sheet $800 billion of mainly government bonds. Now it's got over $3 trillion of assets, trillion with a T, and most of it's garbage, which all of us are going to have to pay for someday because much of it is going to turn out to be worthless, or at least they're going to take big losses on it. Quantitative easing is more money pumped into the system, artificial money pumped into the system, money being printed, if you will. It's going to lead to more inflation, more failures, more taxes that we're all going to have to pay to save mistakes by unelected, unaccountable central banks who don't know what they're doing. The main cause is we're getting good news, but remember there's an election in November of 2012. Whenever there's an election, the politicians spend a lot of money, print a lot of money trying to get reelected, put out a lot of good news. The inflation numbers are obviously absurd. The unemployment numbers, if you get into the unemployment numbers, you see that they're jiggled and manipulated. No, I mean, they've got all these things like the births and deaths adjustments. These numbers, yes, there's good news coming. The reality behind the good news is not so good. The debt continues to rise, and we're all getting into a worse fundamental situation than we had before, and we're all going to pay for it. Be very careful and worried about 2013 and 2014. I don't find that terribly worrisome. I'm glad that if I were a banker, I'd be glad they're paying interest on reserves. It seems to me that they should be paying interest on reserves. The basic problem is we shouldn't have the central bank in the first place. The free market, the market can take better care of interest rates and the currency than the central bank. Now, we've had three central banks in American history. The first two disappear. This one's making many, many serious mistakes, and if you ask me, it's going to disappear too, because they make such foolish mistakes. A world without central banks has problems, but a world with central banks, as demonstrated by the current central bank in America, is going to have worse problems. They're printing so much money, they are buying so many garbage assets, which somebody has to pay for eventually. No, this central bank is making worse mistakes. It will be good for all of us when this central bank eventually disappears. The U.S. long-term government bond market is certainly a bubble. I cannot conceive of lending money to the United States government in U.S. dollars for 30 years at 3 or 4 or 5, or you name the interest rate. It's just ludicrous. The U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world now. These debts will never be paid. They may be inflated away, they may be defaulted, but they can never, ever be paid. Another bubble which I see forming is tertiary education in America. I mean, we're all told we have to go to college, just like we were all told we had to buy a house or should have a house. Well, all of these free loans and free education has made the price of education go through the roof. To go to an Ivy League school now, it's going to cost you $300,000 or $400,000 before you're out over the next few years. The way tuition and everything keeps going higher and higher. Many of these people are coming out with staggering debts. They're not going to get jobs that they can ever pay these debts off. No, tertiary education in America is another bubble which is developing. Football clubs in Europe, soccer teams. Everybody's paying absurd prices for soccer teams, taking on gigantic debt. I guess the same thing is happening in American franchises. People keep paying remarkable prices with the idea that they'll be able to sell them to some other person, if you will. That's certainly a bubble that's taking place. I'm sure there are many others. I just can't think of them off the top of my head. Well, China has been trying to cool its economy off, rightly so. Been trying to pop the real estate bubble. It seems that they're being successful at that. They've been trying to cool inflation. Doesn't seem, well, they've been somewhat successful, but not very successful in my view. But the Chinese economy is still going to continue to be stronger than the U.S. economy. I don't know that they will continue to buy large amounts of U.S. government debt. They know the problems that the U.S. faces now. They know that the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. They know that money's being printed. So it's not so much their ability to buy our debt. Will they buy our debt? The Chinese economy is going to have slowdowns as we go forward. In the 19th century, America had many depressions with a D. We had plenty of problems. Well, China will certainly have problems going forward. And there will be times when good sense will prevail, and they will cut back. I don't think it's so much that they cannot buy our debt, as they just are not going to buy our debt, because there are better things to do with the money. But there will certainly be slowdowns in China. There could be recessions in China. China's doesn't have some magic wand that they never have the same problems that everybody else has. Yes, I've said that the Chinese call themselves communists, but I assure you that they are among the best capitalists in the world. There are people who say that they are the best capitalists in the world as we speak. And yes, there are more regulations, more absurd things going on in places like California than there are in China these days. I know business people who say, I'd rather do business in China than just about anywhere in the world because it's more open than other places in the world. Maybe someday they'll have massive numbers of regulations and controls and absurdities, but at the moment, most people find it easier to do business there. And if nothing else, China's opening up, becoming more capitalist, while California and Massachusetts and other places are becoming more restrictive and less open. Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that it's simple arithmetic. It's pretty clear. It's simple arithmetic. It's simple actuarial calculations. Social Security is bankrupt. The way benefits are planned now and plotted now, they cannot pay them all. Whether it happens in 2020 or 2030 or 2040 is not that relevant. It cannot work the way it's going now. Look, America, the obligations that America has number in the trillions with a T, including the off-balance sheet and the many other obligations which the American government has accepted and guaranteed. America cannot pay these debts. They're trillions and trillions of dollars. Social Security is one of those things where they have promised X, Y, and Z, and they cannot meet the promises that they have said. It's arithmetic. This is not rocket science. This is arithmetic. Figure it out. Who knows whether he can or not? I think that the market is not going to let him do that. But let's suppose he does. What that leads to is even higher and higher debt. Instead of taking the pain now, cutting back spending, cutting back taxes, and stopping this gigantic skyrocket of debt and potential problems, it's better to bite the bullet now. But let's say he can keep the rates down. It's going to be that much more debt, and eventually rates are going to go higher. I haven't done the arithmetic, but plenty of people have done the arithmetic that when rates go back to even 3%, that has a staggering effect on the interest payments of the United States government. And that's just more of the obligations that are going to make America face more crises and more semi-crises. Yes, whenever you pass regulations, smart people try to find ways around them. It's been happening for a few thousand years throughout history. If you tax something, you have less of it. People are pretty smart. They figure out ways to get around the politicians and the bureaucrats, and anything you do, somebody's going to figure out a way to get around it. Well, no, of course I'm not in favor of raising taxes. I'm in favor of cutting taxes. The American public can decide better what to do with its money than obviously the people in Washington, D.C. So you need to cut spending and you need to cut taxes. I don't see any reason to raise taxes at all. You need to cut taxes. Well, Canada's been much sounder managed in the past 15 or 20 years than the U.S. has, partly because they were forced to. I mean, they essentially went bankrupt or almost bankrupt in the early 90s, so they were forced to reform and run a tight ship. And they have lots of natural resources, so Canada's certainly a better place than the U.S. I would be a little bit worried about Canada. I suspect you're going to see real estate problems there. They've had a real estate almost a bubble, dare I say bubble. I mean, things have gotten really hot in Canada, so I suspect you're going to see some problems in finance and in mortgages and even in home ownership in Canada in the next few years. But essentially, Canada, the problems will not be like they were in the U.S. because they don't have the same excesses that we had here. But they will have problems. I do think you'll see more and more people going to Canada. You already do, because if nothing else, they're receptive to immigration. They encourage immigration. We in the United States are doing our best to discourage immigration. I would let anybody who wanted to move to the U.S. move to the U.S. like it was. It's only been in the past. When did they pass those laws restricting immigration? They started in the 20s. For 100 to 150 years, America was an open country. Anybody who wanted to come here could. And in fact, we encouraged people. We gave people land. The Homestead Act gave people land. They would come to America, settle and improve the land and improve their lives. The Canadians are doing some of that now. They are encouraging people to come to Canada. They want immigration. And immigration is good for a country. You need new brains. The people who immigrate to a new country are ambitious, driven, hard-working people, or they wouldn't pack up, and brave, or they wouldn't pack up and leave everything that makes is secure for them. So countries are built by immigration. New capital, new brains, new ideas, new energy. I'm all for immigration. Well, the Canadians are much more receptive to immigration. Now, we in the U.S. are going the other way and starting to close off. Well, everything is facing a bigger crash in the future. Maybe not percentage-wise for home prices like they crashed already, but when the next time we have a economic slowdown in the U.S., it's going to be worse than before. 2002 we had a slowdown. 2008 was worse because the debt was all the way up here. Well, the next time around, the debt is going to be way up there, and so the next economic slowdown is going to be even worse, and a lot of things are going to crash in price, including homes again. But it's not, we don't have the massive overbuilding and speculation that we had before, but we still have too many homes. We still have some problems. So yes, prices can go down again. In the next recession they will, but everything will go down in the next recession. In the 1920s and 1930s, the center of the world moved from the UK to the US, exacerbated by a financial crisis and mistakes made by politicians. Most people didn't notice the shift at the time. We have another historic shift taking place now from the U.S. to Asia. The largest creditor nations in the world now are China, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore. That's where the assets are. That's where the energy is. That's where the ambition is. You know who the debtor nations are and where they are. The largest debtor nation in the history of the world is the United States. So we have another shift to Asia, which again, some people are talking about, some people are trying to stop, but it's being exacerbated by a financial crisis and mistakes made by politicians. Throughout history, we've had long periods when the financial types were in charge, followed by long periods when the producers of real goods were in charge, farmers, miners, etc. Again, then followed by when the financial types were in charge again. At the moment, the world is shifting again. Finance is going to be a bad place to be in the next 20 or 30 years. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, finance was a backwater. Wall Street was a backwater. Nobody went there. The City of London was even worse in those days. Then along came the bull market in the 80s, 90s, etc., and finance became a great place to be. But in 1958, America produced 5,000 MBAs per year. The rest of the world produced none. Last year, America produced 200,000 MBAs a year, and the rest of the world produced tens of thousands. So you have massive competition in finance at a time where the debts are staggering, huge debts in finance now, huge leverage, and of course politicians around the world are coming down hard on financial types. They are passing taxes, regulations, controls, everybody, Sarbanes-Oxley, Dodd-Frank, they're coming up with all sorts of things to punish and restrict finance. So finance is going back into decline, and it will be in decline for a long time, and the people who produce real goods are on the rise. Yeah. The taxi drivers are going to be ex-stockbrokers. The smart ex-stockbrokers will learn to drive tractors so that they can drive tractors for the farmers who are going to be rich going forward.